U.S. history shouldn't feel like a luxury purchase, a guessing game, or a lecture you were never really given. If books are out of budget, you don't know where to start, or your class skipped the good parts, this channel is for you. Here, we take the stories that shaped the United States and make them clear, sourced, and human. We zoom in on people usually left out, set events in context, and show how power works without gatekeeping or jargon. No paywalls, no sponsorships, no monetization. This is a nonprofit space built for learners, not ads. Every episode cites its sources and points you to ways to keep reading. From First Contact to Reconstruction, labor strikes to landmark court cases, grassroots movements to presidential decisions, we'll trace what happened, why it mattered, and who paid the price or pushed for change. If you've ever felt behind, you're not. Start anywhere. Ask questions. Disagree respectfully. Learning is the point. Subscribe, comment with what you want covered next, and share this with someone who deserves a better history class. The American Revolution is often remembered as a heroic struggle for liberty and Republican ideals. Yet beneath its democratic rhetoric lay a complex battle over social order, one in which colonial elites channeled popular unrest against a distant monarchy while safeguarding their own status at home. Far from being purely a principled uprising of united colonists, the revolution can be understood as a strategic movement by American gentry to redirect class tensions and preserve hierarchy. Colonial elites, many themselves aggrieved by British policies, also feared the mounting discontent of farmers, laborers, frontier settlers, women, enslaved people, and indigenous nations. By leading a revolt against Britain, they forged a new national consensus that neutralized internal conflicts without fundamentally altering entrenched social and economic power structures. This essay examines the revolution through the lens of class conflict and elite consolidation, exploring the popular uprisings that preceded independence, the broader Atlantic context of war and empire, the ideological currents and material interests at play, the roles of marginalized groups, indigenous peoples, women, and African Americans, and the post-1783 outcomes such as the Constitution and early capitalist development. In doing so, we see how the revolution's promise of liberty was tempered by the imperatives of property and power. Decades before the Continental Congress declared independence, the American colonies had been riven by internal strife pitting ordinary colonists against colonial authorities. These lesser-known uprisings formed an indispensable backdrop to 1776. They revealed deep class grievances and tested how far elites would go to maintain control. 3 episodes in particular: Bacon's Rebellion 1676 in Virginia, the Regulator Movement 1766 to 1771 in the Carolinas, and the Green Mountain Boys' resistance in the 1760s to 70s illustrate the long-running tensions between common people and the colonial ruling class. Bacon's Rebellion 1676 in the late 17th century, Virginia's hierarchy was upended when an unlikely alliance of frontiersmen, landless former indentured servants, and enslaved Africans rose up against the colonial government. Governor William Berkeley's refusal to aggressively combat frontier Indian tribes, combined with falling tobacco prices, heavy taxes, and lack of land, had angered small farmers and freed servants on the frontier. Nathaniel Bacon, himself a wealthy newcomer but a champion of the discontented, led a violent insurrection that briefly seized Jamestown. The rebellion's social composition alarmed the planter elite. White and black laborers had united against their betters. One contemporary observed that 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed, underscoring elite fears of the dangerous masses of landless former servants. The rebels even issued a declaration of the people decrying the wealthy favorites of the governor for levying great unjust taxes on the poor and failing to protect the frontier from Indian raids. Though Bacon's rebellion ultimately collapsed, it left an enduring legacy. The colonial upper class, chastened by this interracial uprising, moved to harden the system of racial caste to prevent future cross-racial alliances among the poor. As one historian notes, the alliance between European indentured servants and Africans disturbed the colonial upper class. They responded by hardening the racial caste of slavery in an attempt to divide the 2 races from subsequent united uprisings. Indeed, after 1676, Virginia accelerated its shift from indentured servitude to chattel African slavery, providing planters a lifelong, hereditary labor force and elevating even poor European colonists as whites in the social order. In short, elites learned that conceding some privilege to poorer whites, while oppressing black people, could forestall class solidarity. Bacon's rebellion thus stands as an early template for elite strategy. Address popular anger by redirecting it, in this case against indigenous peoples, and by reshuffling social divisions to secure the hierarchy. On the eve of the Revolution, nearly a century after Bacon, a wave of grassroots rebellion again rocked colonial society, this time in the backcountry of the Carolinas. The Regulators were mostly small farmers in the inland frontier, who rose up against what they saw as corrupt, tyrannical provincial officials and coastal elites. In North Carolina, from 1766 to 1771, thousands of settlers in Orange, Granville, and nearby counties organized to protest extortionate taxes, land fees, and unequal political representation. Royal Governor William Tryon's circle of wealthy officials and lawyers, the so-called courthouse ring, dominated local government, exploiting backcountry folk through courts and sheriffs. The Regulators demanded honest government and a more equitable economic system, instead of a system that heavily benefited the colonial officials and their network of plantation owners mainly near the coast. Far from seeking an end to British rule, these insurgents aimed to make the colony's political process more equal and ensure better economic conditions for everyone under the existing framework. In essence, this was a rural class revolt against provincial oligarchy. Historian John Spencer Bassett famously called the Regulator uprising a peasants' rising, a popular upheaval. The conflict escalated into open warfare. In May 1771, at the Battle of Alamance, Tryon's militia crushed some 2,000 armed farmers, executing Regulator leaders and dispersing the movement. Yet the Regulator War left a potent memory. Years later, during debates over independence, patriots would invoke the Regulators as precursors of the Revolution, local heroes who had resisted oppression. Indeed, the Regulators' experience revealed how sharply elite and popular notions of liberty could diverge on the eve of independence. The farmers had their own vision of economic freedom and just governance, one that colonial gentlemen did not necessarily share. To win broad support for revolution, elite patriots would need to address, or at least promise to address, the grievances of these backcountry folk. At the same time, the harsh suppression of the Regulators signaled that colonial elites, whether royal appointees or patriot leaders, would use force to maintain order. This foreshadowed the later willingness of American authorities to put down uprisings like Shays Rebellion, once again in defense of the propertied class. Class conflict in pre-revolutionary America was not confined to taxation and representation. It also played out in violent disputes over land on the frontier. In the territory between New York and New Hampshire, today's Vermont settlers who held New Hampshire land grants banded together in the 1760s to resist the claims of New York's colonial elite. Wealthy New York landlords, armed with royal decrees giving New York jurisdiction, attempted to assert control and evict the homesteaders. In response, Ethan Allen and his cousins formed the Green Mountain Boys, a militia cum vigilante force dedicated to defending the New Hampshire grants. Numbering several hundred, the Green Mountain Boys effectively controlled the contested region by the early 1770s, operating as a de facto frontier government and scaring off New York authorities. They harassed or attacked surveyors and sheriffs sent from New York, making it impossible for the colony to enforce its laws in the Green Mountains. This was, in effect, another internal rebellion. Settlers and land speculators of modest means defying the property claims of a distant elite. Though Ethan Allen himself was a gentleman farmer, his followers were largely rough-hewn frontiersmen, and they shared a conviction that imperial authorities, in this case the government of New York, were treating them unjustly. In time, the Green Mountain Boys would align with the Patriot cause, famously helping capture Fort Ticonderoga in 1775. But their pre-war insurgency added to the patchwork of popular resistance movements preceding the Revolution. It showed that many colonial Americans were already in arms, not against King George per se, but against local structures of power and privilege. By adopting the mantle of revolution, leaders of the new United States could harness militant groups like the Green Mountain Boys and legitimize their cause as part of the fight against Britain, rather than against American elites. Notably, the Green Mountain Boys' territory declared itself the Republic of Vermont in 1777, and, although not admitted as a state until 1791, it outlawed slavery and was led by men like Allen, who were relatively egalitarian for their day. Their story underscores that revolutionary unrest bubbled up in provincial hinterlands, largely apart from lofty Enlightenment ideals. It was about land, autonomy, and local justice. To keep such movements from splintering the united front against Britain, patriot elites worked to fold them into the broader war effort. In all these cases, we observe a pattern. American colonial society was restless and divided, with class antagonisms and regional grievances frequently erupting into revolt. Colonial elites learned from these episodes that popular anger could be explosive, but also that it could be directed. Bacon aimed the anger of poor colonists at Native Americans and a royal governor. The Regulators initially aimed theirs at corrupt officials rather than King George. The Green Mountain Boys fought New York's government while later serving the Patriot Army. As revolutionary fervor grew in the 1770s, prominent patriots, many of them wealthy planters, merchants, and lawyers, recognized the opportunity to lead a unified rebellion against Britain. By positioning themselves at the head of the resistance to imperial oppression, they could both enlist the masses and keep a handle on them. The goal, in part, was to prevent these smoldering class conflicts from targeting the colonial gentry themselves. Instead, Britain would serve as the convenient villain. To understand how this strategy succeeded, we must consider the wider Atlantic world pressures and ideological currents that shaped the Revolutionary era. The American Revolution did not occur in a vacuum. It unfolded amid far-reaching developments across the Atlantic world. A series of imperial wars, shifting strategies of empire, and the pervasive system of Atlantic slavery all set the stage for colonial rebellion. These factors provided both the motive and opportunity for colonial elites to assert greater autonomy, even as they revealed contradictions between the colonists' libertarian ideals and their own social practices. The mid-18th century was an age of almost constant warfare between the great powers of Europe, and the North American colonies were inevitably drawn in. The most significant conflict was the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, called the French and Indian War in the colonies, in which Britain and its colonists fought France and its native allies for control of North America. Britain's victory in 1763 was sweeping but costly. The empire gained Canada and vast new western territories, but also staggered under a greatly enlarged national debt and the expenses of administering new lands. Seeking to have the colonists shoulder a share of the burden, Parliament embarked on a program of tighter imperial control and taxation. This represented a sudden shift from decades of salutary neglect, during which the colonies had largely governed and taxed themselves. After 1763, however, British leaders like George Grenville asserted that since the war had been fought partly to defend the American colonies, the Americans should help pay for it. They began enforcing customs duties such as the Sugar Act of 1764 and imposed new taxes starting with the Stamp Act of 1765 to raise revenue. The colonists, long accustomed to loose oversight, reacted with fury. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry, an old English principle traced back to Magna Carta that Parliament could not tax British subjects without their consent. American pamphleteers like James Otis invoked the rights of Englishmen to trial by jury and self-taxation through their own assemblies. In their view, Parliament's taxes violated both the British Constitution and the natural rights of the colonists. Thus, the 7 Years' War and Britain's new imperial program directly precipitated the constitutional quarrel that led to revolution. Yet the conflict was not only about abstract rights, it was also about economic self-interest and class. British mercantile policies pinched influential colonial groups, for instance, the 1764 Currency Act, by forbidding colonial paper money, hit indebted farmers and small merchants who relied on local currency. The Stamp Act and Townshend Acts affected powerful colonial lawyers, printers and traders, by taxing legal documents, newspapers, and imported goods. These measures galvanized well-to-do colonists into resistance alongside the middling sort. At the same time, common people protested that new taxes and trade rules came during a post-war economic recession when British creditors were demanding hard currency payment of colonial debts. The post-1763 British crackdown thus alienated a broad spectrum of colonial society, from rich merchants to humble farmers. Elites could capitalize on this discontent, but to do so, they often had to embrace popular tactics like mob protests and boycotts that previously they might have shunned. The shared opposition to British taxation helped mask the class divides that remained within the Patriot camp. Another imperial policy after the 7 Years' War that inflamed colonial elites and frontiersmen alike was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Intended to stabilize relations with Native Americans, the proclamation forbade Anglo-American settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving those lands for indigenous peoples. To land-hungry colonists, including speculators like George Washington who had interests in western tracts, this was an outrageous obstruction of their right to expand. Indeed, the Declaration of Independence would later list as a grievance that Britain had endeavored to prevent the population of these states by hindering western settlement. The Crown's motive was partly pragmatic. Having acquired the Ohio Valley from France, London wanted to avoid further costly wars with native tribes like those that occurred during Pontiac's Rebellion of 1763. British officials also viewed unlimited westward expansion as threatening to their mercantilist system. They feared independent frontier farmers would trade outside the empire and slip beyond effective governance. So London hoped to confine colonists to the seaboard, where they could be more easily regulated, encouraging settlement instead in the newly acquired but safer provinces of Quebec and Florida. From the colonist perspective, however, the proclamation line was infuriating. It seemed to favor merciless Indian savages, as the Declaration dubbed them, over British subjects, and to deny Americans the fruits of victory in the late war. Colonists of varying socioeconomic backgrounds viewed the proclamation line and its restrictions as repressive measures put in place by the Crown to secure increased control. Settlers largely ignored the boundary and poured westward anyway, while colonial governments lobbied strenuously against the British policy. This conflict over Indian land was not simply sectional east versus west, but also class-based wealthier coastal elites sometimes had reasons to honor peace with certain native nations for the fur trade or stable borders, whereas small farmers and squatters on the frontier almost universally demanded unrestricted access to indigenous lands. By taking up the Patriot cause, frontier populations hoped to nullify British-imposed limits on expansion. And indeed, once independence was achieved, the young United States promptly repudiated the proclamation line and set its sights on the trans-Appalachian West, often at the direct expense of native peoples. Perhaps the most profound contradiction and darkest context of the American Revolution was the institution of slavery. In 1776, the cry of liberty rang out from a society where roughly 1/5 of the population was enslaved. Enslaved African Americans, about 500,000 in number, toiled in all 13 colonies, though mostly in the South, producing the commodities, tobacco, rice, indigo, sugar, cotton, that enriched the colonial elite and tied America into the Atlantic trading system. Leading patriots like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Hancock were themselves slaveholders or directly profited from slavery. How, then, did the Revolution address this entrenched system? The answer is complex. The Revolution both challenged and ultimately accommodated slavery in ways that reveal the limits of its egalitarian promise. In the imperial crisis of the 1760s to 70s, slavery was seldom openly debated by white colonists. However, slavery was always an unspoken backdrop to colonial notions of liberty. British officials and writers often pointed out the hypocrisy of American planters who decried enslavement by Parliament while keeping people in bondage. Samuel Johnson acidly asked, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" Indeed, Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence even accused King George III of forcing slavery upon the colonies, a charge so disingenuous coming from a slave owner that it was removed from the final document. The reality was that many Patriot leaders were deeply committed to preserving slavery, Part of their quarrel with Britain stemmed from fear that metropolitan policy might someday threaten the institution. This fear spiked in 1772 when Lord Mansfield's ruling in the Somerset case effectively declared slavery unsupported by English common law in England, stirring Southern anxieties about imperial interference. Tensions boiled over in 1775 when Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved person of rebel masters who would join the British forces. Dunmore's proclamation sent shockwaves through the South. Slaveholders, even some who had been lukewarm toward the Patriot cause, now flocked to the rebellion, furious at Britain for inciting, as they saw it, servile insurrection. By contrast, thousands of enslaved African Americans saw the British offer as a beacon of hope and fled to British lines. One British officer reported that escaped slaves came wearing badges that read "Liberty" to the slaves. All told, perhaps 20,000 African Americans, a considerable number, aligned with the British in some capacity during the war. For Black Americans, the revolution was not abstract. It was an immediate opportunity to claim freedom. Enslaved people used the tumult of war to escape, enlist, or negotiate better conditions. About 5,000 African Americans, enslaved and free, served in the Continental Army or militia, despite initial bans on black enlistment. Northern states like Rhode Island and Massachusetts eventually offered freedom to slaves who served in Patriot forces. Meanwhile, the British evacuation in 1783 carried away an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 formerly enslaved men, women, and children, people who had fled to the Redcoats and secured passage to new lives in Nova Scotia, the West Indies, or Britain. In South Carolina and Georgia, as many as 1/4 of the enslaved population escaped during the chaos of war. This massive dislocation was a grassroots social revolution of its own, enslaved people seizing freedom whenever fortunes of war allowed. Yet for all these individual gains, the American Revolution stopped short of truly disrupting slavery as a system. In fact, in the constitutional settlement that followed, slavery received renewed protections. The Patriot elite, especially from the South, had no intention of emancipating their human property. In some northern states, the ideological tide did turn against slavery. Pennsylvania in 1780 became the first state to pass gradual emancipation, and others followed in the 1780s and 90s. Abolitionist sentiment grew among Quakers, Methodists, and certain intellectuals, and the rhetoric of universal rights emboldened free black communities to petition legislatures for equal rights. But in the plantation South, slavery emerged from the Revolution not only intact but poised for expansion. The new republic's constitution explicitly guarded slavery where it existed, and even bargained away moral principle by extending the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years and embedding a fugitive slave clause. As one historian succinctly notes, the Revolution failed to end the institution of slavery in America. Instead, the economy's reliance on slavery proved to be a defining element in the creation of the new United States government. When the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, its Southern delegates ensured protections for slaveholders' interests, counting slaves as 3/5 of a person for representation, barring Congress from banning the slave trade until 1808, and providing federal support to suppress slave rebellions. These concessions underscore that the freedom celebrated in 1776 was narrowly defined. It largely applied to propertied white men, and it was entirely compatible with the bondage of others. In the broader Atlantic context, the American Revolution occurred alongside other upheavals. Most notably, it preceded the French Revolution 1789 and the Haitian Revolution 1791, which did directly confront slavery and racial inequality. Many in the founding generation were aware of how radical the logic of liberty could become. In Haiti, enslaved people threw off their chains and created an independent black republic, terrifying slaveholders throughout the Americas. By comparison, American independence was a more conservative revolution. Colonial elites successfully navigated between radical change and preservation of order. They adopted the liberal language of natural rights and equality, drawn from European Enlightenment thinkers, to justify separation from Britain, but they constrained how those ideals applied domestically. In a very real sense, the American Revolution expanded political participation for white men. More could vote and hold office than before, while consolidating elite control over the social and economic system, including slavery. The patriots who led the revolution were animated by ideas as well as interests. Enlightenment philosophy, British constitutionalism, and Republican political theory all supplied intellectual fuel for independence. These high-minded ideals were sincerely held by many and helped galvanize public support. At the same time, colonial leaders applied and sometimes limited these principles in ways that aligned with their material interests, particularly the protection of property and the maintenance of social order. Understanding the interplay of ideology and interest is key to analyzing how colonial elites managed to lead a popular revolution that did not ultimately overturn the class hierarchy. The revolution's architects were children of the Enlightenment. They had read Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. They debated the latest ideas from Paris and Edinburgh. Enlightenment ideas stressed reason, individual rights, and skepticism of authority, a perfect matrix for challenging royal rule. John Locke's theory of natural rights was especially influential. Locke taught that all individuals are endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, existing to protect those rights. If a government became tyrannical and violated the social contract, Locke argued, the people had a right to revolution. Thomas Jefferson and his compatriots absorbed these ideas deeply. Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, 1776, framed the American Revolution in terms taken from Locke's essays, explicitly grounding the case for independence on the rights of man and the social contract. Jefferson's immortal preamble, "All men are created equal and possess certain unalienable rights," is practically a paraphrase of Locke, with Jefferson's poetic flourish of pursuit of happiness in place of Locke's property. Beyond Locke, Montesquieu's advocacy of separation of powers influenced the new state constitutions and later the U.S. Constitution with their divided executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The Enlightenment emphasis on liberty, constitutional government, and separation of church and state found receptive ground in America, where colonial political culture already valued self-rule and religious dissent. As revolutionary leader Benjamin Franklin quipped in 1776, the Americans were a people who already had enlightenment before the Enlightenment. However, the deployment of Enlightenment ideals by American elites was selective. They pushed the concept of universal rights far enough to unify colonists against Britain, but not so far as to upend gender, race, or property relations at home. For example, the rhetoric of equality did not extend to women or enslaved Africans who were excluded from the new polity. The notion of popular sovereignty was embraced to throw off Parliament's authority, yet many founders remained deeply suspicious of too much democracy among their own citizens, fearing mob rule or leveling schemes that might threaten property. In other words, revolutionary leaders walked a fine line. They had to champion the principle of equality and consent to gain broad support while reassuring their peers that independence wouldn't mean a social revolution that stripped the wealthy of privilege. This tension was evident in the writing of the era. Thomas Paine's Common Sense 1776 took Enlightenment arguments to the masses, condemning monarchy as foolish and calling not only for independence but for a radically democratic republic. Elites welcomed Paine's help in stirring common folk to the cause, but few endorsed his more leveling impulses. Indeed, John Adams privately considered Paine a dangerous radical. Similarly, the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776, penned by George Mason, proclaimed that all men are by nature equally free and independent. Yet in practice, Virginia maintained slavery and restricted the franchise to propertied white men. The Enlightenment credo of rational governance inspired Americans to create new republican institutions, but how far those institutions would actually embody egalitarianism was a matter of intense debate, and one usually settled in favor of the propertied class. Alongside abstract Enlightenment ideals, American revolutionaries drew heavily on the concrete tradition of British constitutional rights. In their view, the struggle with Britain was about preserving ancient liberties against ministerial usurpation. The colonists revered documents like Magna Carta 1215, the Petition of Rights 1628, and the English Bill of Rights 1689 as bulwarks of their freedom. They believed Englishmen had established rights, such as no taxation without consent, no deprivation of property without due process, trial by jury, habeas corpus, etc., and that by immigrating to America they carried these rights with them. For decades, the colonists had governed their own local affairs under colonial charters, with elected assemblies taxing and legislating for their population. This bred a sense of entitlement to self-rule. When Parliament after 1763 started imposing taxes and laws on them directly, Americans protested that their rights as Englishmen were being violated. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," encapsulated this argument. Since colonists had no representatives at Westminster, Parliament could not legally tax them. Only their own assemblies, analogues to the House of Commons, had that right. Patriots like James Otis and Samuel Adams framed their resistance in these terms. Otis asserted in 1764 that no part of His Majesty's dominions can be taxed without their consent. Every part has a right to be represented. Otherwise, the act of taxation was void as a contradiction to the theory of the Constitution. The colonists thus cast themselves as defenders of the true British Constitution against a corrupt Parliament and ministry that had overstepped its bounds. Even in declaring independence, Congress in 1776 argued that King George III had subverted the Constitution and lost his legitimacy. This conservative, legalistic line of reasoning gave the revolution a certain respectability and coherence. It was not an anarchic rebellion but a justified defense of traditional rights. Of course, invoking the rights of Englishmen had a double edge. It powerfully united colonists against external oppression, but it also implied limits on how far liberty should be extended internally. After all, English tradition was compatible with aristocratic privilege, property qualifications for voting, and the political exclusion of women and others. Many elites saw their struggle as preserving the rights of their class and communities, not creating an entirely new social order. Some radicals, like Paine, began to argue that all mankind should enjoy the rights championed in 1776, but many American leaders were more comfortable with the idea that they were asserting long-established rights for British subjects in America. Ironically, the victory of this argument for independence meant that after 1783, American leaders no longer spoke of themselves as Englishmen. They had to articulate a new basis for rights, usually natural rights common to all men. Yet in practice, the new United States often behaved like Britain Redux, governed by gentlemen of property, protective of inherited privileges, and quick to quell challenges from below. It would be a mistake to think the Founding Fathers were only self-interested grandees cynically mouthing ideals. Many were genuine in their Enlightenment-inspired convictions. However, virtually all of them also had concrete economic and political interests that independence would serve. These interests help explain why the patriot elite coalesced and why they pursued certain policies. Economically, independence promised freedom from British trade restrictions, the Navigation Acts, and the opening of westward lands. Northern merchants chafed under mercantilist laws that required certain goods to be shipped through Britain, or banned manufacturing in the colonies. Southern planters feared imperial measures that might restrict slavery or undercut their debts. Many Southern planters owed money to British creditors and resented efforts to collect. All elites bristled at British taxes that cut into their profits. For instance, John Hancock, a wealthy Boston merchant and prominent patriot, had been a notorious smuggler under the Navigation Acts. For men like him, British enforcement threatened their commercial fortunes. Land speculators, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Patrick Henry, had stakes in trans-Appalachian land companies, ventures that were stymied by British policies like the Proclamation of 1763. These men knew that an American government, free of London's qualms, would likely unleash settlement and speculation in the West, enriching those positioned to capitalize on it. Indeed, Washington wrote passionately about the importance of expanding into the Ohio country. Moreover, printing money and managing the colonial economy free from metropolitan oversight appealed to colonial debtors and investors. Politically, many colonial office holders and lawyers felt stymied by royal governors and the imperial hierarchy. Ambitious young planters and attorneys, think Jefferson, Madison, John Adams, saw in independence a chance to rise to the top of a new political system. Colonial legislatures had long feuded with royal officials over who should control appointments and policy. The revolution offered local elites the prospect of home rule, them ruling at home, rather than obeying distant bureaucrats. To be sure, that home rule was not intended to be mob rule, men of property expected to govern in the place of aristocratic parliamentarians and royally appointed governors, not to yield power to their own poorer neighbors. But they calculated that they could rally those neighbors to the cause with ringing declarations of liberty and by pointing to common grievances against Britain. It was a classic case of aligning elite and popular interests against an external foe. This alignment was perhaps best summarized by a Philadelphia artisan at the time, who quipped that in supporting the patriot cause, t'other day, we were declared rebels for resisting King George. Today we are rebels if we resist King Congress. His sardonic point was that the locus of authority was changing, but ordinary folk might still find themselves subordinate, only now to an American ruling class. And indeed, once independence was won, the wealthy patriot gentlemen set about constructing a government that would restrain excessive democracy. But during the war years, the elites needed the common people to fill the Continental Army's ranks, to boycott British goods, to keep local order, and to lend legitimacy to the nascent republic. Therefore, patriot leaders engaged in a constant balancing act. They fostered a spirit of egalitarianism and rights to fuel resistance, but they also worked to co-opt or dampen any radical impulses that might turn against wealth or hierarchy. One illustrative example is the way the Continental Congress handled internal economic unrest during the war. Inflation and food shortages sparked riots. By 1779, crowds of women in Boston and Philadelphia raided warehouses of hoarded goods, demanding just prices. Rather than siding wholeheartedly with the poor, patriot authorities tried to mediate but often ended up protecting private property rights. They passed measures to control prices or require farmers to sell to the army, but they also forcefully quelled mutinies and disorder. The elite commitment to property was never far from the surface. In sum, the ideological roots of the revolution, Enlightenment liberalism and English constitutionalism, gave patriot elites a powerful vocabulary to articulate their cause. These ideas genuinely inspired many Americans and broadened the revolution's appeal. But the leaders' commitment to those ideals was often conditioned by their own class outlook. They embraced liberty, yet not full social leveling, equality, but mainly equality of rights among propertied white men, democracy, but tempered by checks and balances to prevent majority rule from threatening minority elite interests. The American Revolution thus became, in historian Bernard Bailyn's words, an event of twin revolutions, one ideological, pushing toward expanded rights, and one conservative, seeking to consolidate power in the hands of those traditionally dominant. The outcome would reflect both currents. While elite gentlemen debated philosophy and penned declarations, a broad cast of other actors took part in the revolutionary drama, often pursuing their own aims. Women, enslaved and free black people, and indigenous nations each navigated the revolution in ways that sometimes aligned with patriot goals and sometimes cut against them. These groups were not merely passive bystanders. They were active participants, and their struggles intersected with the revolution's class dynamics. By considering their experiences, we gain a fuller picture of how the war for independence doubled as a social revolution, or in some cases, failed to become one, under the guiding hand of elites. The phrase, "we can do it," had not yet been coined in the 1770s, but the women of the revolution essentially lived that slogan. Colonial women, though legally and politically subordinate to men, found myriad ways to engage in the cause and, in doing so, subtly pushed the boundaries of their traditional roles. On the eve of independence, women had already begun to enter the political sphere through organized resistance groups like the Daughters of Liberty. Founded in 1765–66 during the Stamp Act crisis, the Daughters of Liberty brought together ladies of good reputation to support the patriot protest, most famously by boycotting British goods and spinning homespun cloth so Americans could avoid imported textiles. Newspapers praised these women for displaying a spirit for saving their sinking country by industrious labor from sunrise to dark. Women hosted Spinning Bees public gatherings to spin thread, which turned a domestic chore into a patriotic demonstration. At these assemblies, they pointedly renounced British tea, brewing Liberty tea from local herbs instead. In one account, Rhode Island women cheerfully agreed to omit tea altogether in solidarity with the boycott. By such actions, signing petitions forswearing luxuries and manufacturing goods, women asserted a form of political agency. They translated their traditional activities into decidedly political ones which were widely celebrated and non-threatening to the status quo. In other words, they stretched gender norms without overtly breaking them. Even patriot leaders acknowledged women's importance. Samuel Adams reportedly declared, "With ladies on our side, we can make every Tory tremble," recognizing that women's commitment gave weight to the boycotts. During the war itself, women's involvement broadened further, with tens of thousands of men away in the Continental Army. Women managed farms, shops, and workshops alone. They made gunpowder, sewed uniforms, and raised funds for the troops. In 1780, Philadelphia women, led by Esther de Burt Reed, organized a fundraising drive that collected an astonishing $300,000 Continental currency for Washington soldiers, then converted the money into linen shirts to send to the freezing troops. Women also served as cooks, nurses, and laundresses in military camps, the so-called camp followers, many of them soldiers' wives. A few women even took part in combat legends, like Molly Pitcher at Monmouth or Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man and fought in the ranks, a test of female bravery under arms. Such cases were exceptional but symbolically powerful, suggesting that the line between male and female spheres could blur in the furnace of war. All this meant that the revolution saw women acting far outside their traditional gender roles, as one historian notes. Women not only maintained households in the absence of men, but some raised their voices politically, wrote to their local newspapers, signed petitions, and took part in political protests that sometimes became violent. The war forced society to acknowledge women's capacity, however grudgingly, as participants in public life and economic production. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband John in 1776, urging him to remember the ladies in the new laws of the land, warning that if absolute power was left to husbands, women were determined to foment a rebellion of their own. John Adams amiably dismissed her plea, yet Abigail's letter shows women's awareness that the revolution's principles ought logically to apply to them as well. Despite these extraordinary contributions, the post-war results for women were mixed at best. The end of the fighting brought pressure for women to return to their traditional subordinate sphere. The rhetoric of natural rights largely bypassed women. The new state constitutions, with one notable exception, did not grant women political rights. Indeed, a lasting revolutionary change in terms of women's status as citizens did not materialize. Women could not vote or hold office in the new republic, apart from a temporary loophole in New Jersey's 1776 Constitution that allowed property-owning women to vote until that provision was abolished in 1807. Instead, women's public role was redefined in a way that ultimately reinforced the social hierarchy. Thinkers and educators developed the concept of Republican motherhood. This ideal, emerging in the 1780s, held that women had a vital civic duty indirectly. They were to raise and educate virtuous sons and daughters who would be good Republican citizens. In essence, a woman's political influence would be exercised within the home by inculcating patriotism and morality in her children and supporting her husband's civic engagement. The importance of women's political agency after the war was seen through the lens of their ability to indoctrinate Republican ideals to their children, as one analysis puts it. Prominent men like Benjamin Rush championed female education for this purpose, arguing that mothers needed to be literate and knowledgeable to fulfill their duty of raising enlightened citizens. Thus, one concrete outcome was an expansion of educational opportunities for girls. The post-war period saw the founding of academies for young women, teaching not only needlework but also academic subjects, justified by the needs of the Republic. In that sense, if Republican motherhood advanced women's rights, it was through education reform. Girls' literacy rates rose, and women like Mercy Otis Warren and Judith Sargent Murray emerged to gently press for intellectual and economic independence for women. Still, the overarching result was to reassert patriarchy in a new form. Women were praised as the mothers of the nation, but this role was a tightly prescribed one. Once the crisis passed, men were eager to retrieve the reins of public power. As one scholar observes, the extra domestic deeds of women during the war were afterward not as highly regarded, and many people sought to channel this political energy back into women's more traditional domestic realms. The revolution, in short, did not produce a legal revolution for women. It offered a temporary widening of responsibilities and a permanent, if subordinate, ideological role as educators of citizens, but the fundamental gender hierarchy remained intact. The elite consensus was that social stability required women to remain out of formal politics, even if the new republic asked them to imbue their households with virtue. In preserving that status quo, the emerging American elite avoided the kind of radical feminist upheaval that would not be seen until the much later suffrage movement. From a class conflict perspective, patriot elites, almost all male, were content to rally women to the cause when useful, and just as content to exclude them from power once independence had been secured. The Revolutionary Era was a turning point for African Americans enslaved and free, yet a turning point that fell far short of true liberation. As discussed earlier, thousands of enslaved people seized the fluid circumstances of war to pursue freedom, siding with whichever army seemed to offer the better chance. On the Patriot side, initial reluctance to arm black men gave way under the exigencies of war. By 1778, with manpower running low, even Virginia had agreed to free slaves who served in the Continental ranks. Black soldiers fought bravely in many key battles. The very first martyr of the Patriot cause, Crispus Attucks, killed in the Boston Massacre of 1770, was a man of African and native descent. Northern states enrolled both free blacks and slaves, promising eventual emancipation. Meanwhile, the British made heavy use of the enslaved as laborers, spies, and auxiliary troops whenever they could encourage escape from rebel masters. The presence of armed black men in either camp was a revolutionary sight in a society predicated on white supremacy. One South Carolina patriot lamented, "Our slaves are becoming our masters," as he watched formerly enslaved men don British uniforms. The war's end, however, slammed the door on most of these hopes, particularly in the South. For free African Americans in the North, the post-war period did bring modest progress. Inspired by revolutionary principles, Vermont's 1777 Constitution abolished slavery outright, making it the first polity in North America to do so, and Massachusetts effectively ended slavery by judicial decision in 1783. Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law of 1780 set a model that Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey would follow over the next 2 decades. By 1804, every state north of the Mason-Dixon line had at least formally provided for the eventual end of slavery within its borders, though full freedom often came slowly. In these states, and in the new Northwest Territory, where slavery was barred by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, slavery as an institution waned, and a small but significant free black population developed. Free black communities in cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston established churches, schools, and mutual aid societies in the post-war decades, asserting their claims to the rights of citizens, albeit against fierce resistance and racism. The language of liberty emboldened black writers and ministers. In 1777, a group of Massachusetts slaves petitioned the legislature, declaring that they had in common with all men a natural right to our freedoms, and asking how the colonists' demands for freedom from Britain could be reconciled with the continued enslavement of Africans. Such moral arguments gained some traction in the North, where slavery's economic role was less dominant, and religious abolitionism among Quakers and evangelicals had growing influence. In the South, by contrast, the Revolution's aftermath saw slavery fortified. Many white Southerners interpreted their victory as a license to expand human bondage without outside interference. The British, who had constrained colonial westward expansion and flirted with arming slaves, were gone. Now American slaveholders were the masters of their domain. The Deep South saw an influx of slaveholders from the lost British colony of East Florida, and from the North, bringing enslaved people with them. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 and the opening of lands in the Southwest, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, soon sparked a massive increase in the demand for slave labor, launching the so-called Second Middle Passage of slaves being sold southward. In this sense, the Revolution delayed any reckoning with slavery in the South and instead enabled its growth. The new federal government's hands were tied by the need to appease the Southern elite, a bargain made explicit by the constitutional compromises protecting slavery. Southern planters emerged from the war politically stronger. They held many offices in the new nation and ideologically more entrenched, developing a fierce defense of slavery as essential to Republican liberty, arguing, perversely, that without slaves to do the work, the white citizenry would lack the independence to participate in politics. From a class perspective, one might note that patriot elites in the South managed to turn what could have been a revolutionary assault on their wealth, since slaves were property, into instead a consolidation of that wealth. By taking charge of the revolution in their region, they steered it in a direction that preserved their ownership of human beings. They cloaked their fight as one for universal liberty, all the while maintaining a social order built on the extreme exploitation of a laboring class who had no liberty at all. It is telling that neither the Articles of Confederation nor the Constitution contained a word slave. The founders carefully avoided the term, even as they wove protections for slavery into the nation's fabric. This silence spoke volumes. It was the quiet triumph of elite interests over the rhetoric of equality. African Americans would have to wait another lifetime and fight another war to see those high principles fully applied to them. For the indigenous nations of North America, the American Revolution was an unmitigated disaster in terms of its consequences, even though many tried shrewdly to navigate the conflict. Native peoples were geographically and politically caught between the British Empire and the American rebels, and they sought above all to protect their own homelands and autonomy. Initially, most tribes hoped to stay neutral in what they viewed as a British civil war. They had generally good reason to prefer the status quo. The British, through officials like Sir William Johnson in New York, had maintained relationships and trade with various nations, and had at least made some effort to restrain settler encroachment, for example, via the Proclamation of 1763. The Patriot settlers, by contrast, were known land-hungry aggressors. As one American later admitted, British policies before the war had tried to limit the encroachment of white settlers onto native lands, while American colonists were eager to expand westward. Given this reality, it is not surprising that once neutrality became impossible, the majority of Native American nations sided with the British during the Revolution. Perhaps the most famous example is the Iroquois Confederacy in New York. This centuries-old six-nation alliance, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, was tragically split by the Revolution. The Oneida and Tuscarora chose to support the Americans, influenced by missionary Samuel Kirkland, and hoping that aiding the rebels might earn them favor, while the rest, led in part by Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant, fought with the British. This division shattered the Iroquois Confederacy's unity, pitting members of the once united Longhouse against each other on brutal frontier battlefields. In the Ohio and Illinois regions, nations such as the Shawnee, Delaware, Lenape, Miami, and Creek also largely opposed the Americans, often conducting independent resistance to the onrush of settlers. The Cherokee in the South were divided. A faction known as the Chickamauga Cherokee fought aggressively against frontier settlements in alliance with Britain, while other Cherokee towns sought peace or even allied occasionally with state militias against their renegade kin. Across the board, native decision-making was pragmatic. They assessed which side, if any, might respect their lands. But with the Patriots generally unwilling to promise anything short of conquest, aligning with the British appeared the better option to many tribes. During the war, native warriors proved crucial in several theaters. They knew the land intimately and employed guerrilla tactics that terrorized frontier communities. From 1777 to 1779, joint Loyalist Indian raids by Mohawks, Senecas, and British Rangers like Butler's Rangers devastated settlements in New York and Pennsylvania. These raids prompted one of General George Washington's most ruthless campaigns, the 1779 Sullivan Expedition into Iroquois country. Washington ordered General John Sullivan to march a large Continental Army force into the heart of the Six Nations and not merely overrun, but destroy, burning at least 40 Iroquois towns along with their crops and food stores. This scorched earth policy earned Washington the Iroquois moniker Town Destroyer, a name first given to his great-grandfather and grimly renewed for him. The campaign broke the power of the Iroquois Confederacy as a military force, a harbinger of the post-war fate awaiting most Eastern tribes. The revolution in the West often descended into a dark and bloody ground of back-and-forth massacres. One infamous incident was the 1778 killing of peaceful Christian Lenape, Delaware Indians by Pennsylvania militiamen at Gnadenhutten, an atrocity that only deepened Native resolve to fight on. The British could only supply and coordinate Native allies up to a point. Much of the frontier war saw Natives and American patriots exacting brutal reprisals on each other, largely independent of European oversight. Notably, the war on the frontier continued even after Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown 1781. In 1782, called the Bloody Year on the Frontier, conflict raged as fiercely as ever. The last battle of the Revolutionary War was arguably the Battle of Blue Licks in Kentucky, August 1782, where a group of Kentucky militia, including Daniel Boone, were ambushed and defeated by a force of Loyalists and Native warriors. When the peace treaty was signed in 1783, Native Americans found themselves brutally betrayed. In the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain ceded to the new United States all territory between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, land occupied by numerous sovereign indigenous nations who were not consulted in the negotiations. The British, prioritizing their own geopolitical expediency, abandoned their native allies without securing any protection for them. American representatives were all too happy to accept this windfall of Western land. From that moment, the fate of native peoples was sealed in a pattern of American expansionism. Settlers began pouring over the mountains into the Ohio Valley and beyond, no longer restrained by British garrisons or policy. Many Americans justified dispossession and violence against indigenous peoples by arguing that all natives had sided with the enemy and thus forfeited any rights. As one contemporary rationale went, Indians had unprovokedly commenced war, and so the United States could in justice confiscate their lands as conquerors. The reality, of course, was more complex, but this narrative enabled American leaders to pursue aggressive expansion with a sense of entitlement. Native nations did fight back in the war's aftermath. A broad alliance known as the Western Confederacy, including Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Wyandot, and others, coalesced in the 1780s to resist U.S. incursions north of the Ohio River. They won significant victories, such as the 1791 defeat of General St. Clair's army, the worst loss the U.S. ever suffered against native forces. But ultimately, the Confederacy was crushed at the Battle of Fallen Timbers 1794, and in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, they were forced to cede most of present-day Ohio. The United States, barely a decade old, had thus already begun a relentless westward colonization that would, over the next century, dispossess indigenous peoples of most of their ancestral lands. From the perspective of class and power, Native Americans had the tragic distinction of being outside the new nation's social contract altogether. They were not counted among all men created equal by American leaders. Jefferson, ironically, had a certain admiration for native societies, but assumed they would either assimilate or vanish. Consequently, patriot elites felt free to deal with natives as foreign adversaries or obstacles. The consolidation of elite power in America after the Revolution came with an implicit project: the expansion of American territory for the benefit of the citizenry, especially land speculators and settlers, at the expense of indigenous nations. In effect, one elite agenda, securing American independence and social stability, dovetailed with a broader settler colonial agenda, conquering a frontier. Even lower-class white frontiersmen, who often butted heads with coastal elites on other issues, were partners in this conquest, united by racial hierarchy and hunger for land. The Revolution thus gave rise not to greater justice for native peoples who had aided the British hoping for protection, but to a new republic even less inclined than the Crown to acknowledge indigenous rights. In sum, the Revolution was experienced by different groups in vastly different ways. For the white male elite, it was an opportunity to assert their rights and govern themselves. For working-class whites and farmers, it was a hope, sometimes fulfilled, sometimes not, that their economic grievances would be addressed in the new nation. For women, it was a time of unprecedented public engagement followed by a reassertion of domestic roles, albeit with a new dignity as Republican mothers. For enslaved and free black people, it offered liberty to a few and deep disappointment to many, entrenching a system that denied them the Revolution's fruits. And for indigenous nations, it was a calamitous loss, as one empire gave way to an aggressive republic with seemingly boundless appetite for their lands. Overarching all of this was the navigation and management of these forces by colonial and post-colonial elites who sought to win the war, form a stable nation, and keep social order, goals often intertwined and sometimes at odds. When the guns fell silent in 1783, the question loomed, what kind of country had been born? Would the egalitarian rhetoric of the Revolution translate into a truly democratic society, or would the colonial elite simply refashion themselves as an American ruling class? The decade after independence, the 1780s into the 1790s, answered that question in significant ways. It was a period of consolidation, politically, with the writing of the U.S. Constitution, and economically, with the laying of the foundations for early American capitalism. Yet it was also a time of continued popular ferment, as ordinary people challenged the contours of the new order. Two key developments, Shays Rebellion and the adoption of the Constitution of 1787, reveal how the fledgling nation's elite reacted to internal unrest by creating a stronger central authority that guarded against both British interference and homegrown insurgency. And under this new constitutional regime, figures like Alexander Hamilton steered economic policy toward robust capitalist growth, a project that both served and was led by men of property. In effect, the outcome of the Revolution's second phase was to cement an American ruling structure that balanced liberty with power, granting enough rights to prevent mass discontent, but securing the dominance of propertied interests in the government and economy. The end of the Revolutionary War did not bring economic tranquility. The Confederation of States faced a post-war debt crisis, inflation, and a trade slump as British markets tightened against American exports. The ordinary soldiers of the Continental Army had mostly gone home unpaid or with worthless paper IOUs. Many small farmers returned to find themselves drowning in debt and taxes. States, particularly those like Massachusetts with heavy war debts, raised taxes sharply to pay creditors. Often the creditors were wealthy merchants and speculators who had bought up war bonds. In western Massachusetts by 1786, farmers were seething. They were being hauled into court for foreclosure and debt suits at a rate never seen before. To these farmers, it seemed they had fought a war for liberty, only to be oppressed by their own state's fiscal policies. One veteran farmer, Plow Jogger, complained bitterly that the government took his oxen for unpaid taxes when those very oxen had been used to haul cannon for the patriot cause. Resentment finally exploded into open insurrection in late 1786 in what is known as Shays Rebellion after one of its leaders, Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain. Shays Rebellion saw armed groups of distressed farmers rising up to shut down courts and prevent foreclosures. It was a direct revolt against the new elite of Massachusetts, the Eastern merchants, lawyers, and legislators under Governor James Bowdoin, who had set harsh economic policies. From August 1786 through January 1787, thousands of farmers calling themselves Regulators in homage to the earlier North Carolina movement mobilized in the Massachusetts Highlands. They marched on county courthouses in Northampton, Worcester, and Springfield, blocking judges from sitting. They issued their own petitions demanding paper money, lower taxes, and a freeze on foreclosures, essentially relief from the creditor class. For months, the state government seemed paralyzed. Local militias were unreliable. Many militiamen sympathized with the rebels and refused to act against them. To the Massachusetts elite, this was an existential threat, a homegrown class war that the weak post-war government might be unable to stop. Governor Bowdoin finally raised a private army of 1,200 men, funded by Boston merchants under General Benjamin Lincoln. In January 1787, this force confronted Shays and about 1,500 rebels as they attempted to seize the federal armory in Springfield, hoping to arm themselves with its stores of weapons. The rebel assault failed. Lincoln's militia fired grapeshot, killing 4 rebels and scattering the rest. Over the following weeks, the insurgency collapsed. A few ringleaders were caught and sentenced to death, though later pardoned, and Shays himself fled to Vermont. While brief and ultimately unsuccessful, Shays' rebellion sent shockwaves through the nascent United States. To the country's conservative leaders, it was a dire warning. General George Washington retired at Mount Vernon, had been monitoring events with alarm. Letters from correspondents like Henry Knox told him that the commotions were spreading and could snowball if not checked. Washington and others feared that the fragile Union under the Articles of Confederation was incapable of handling such internal crises. Indeed, Shays' uprising revealed the impotence of the federal government. Congress under the Articles could not directly raise an army to quell the rebels, nor compel the states to cooperate. Many American elites drew the conclusion that a stronger central government was needed, one that could ensure domestic tranquility by responding swiftly to rebellions and also enact uniform economic policies to prevent such unrest. In other words, Shays' Rebellion became a driving impetus for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. As one observer put it, the late insurrection in Massachusetts has given more energy to the movement for a new government than any other incident. Without Shays' Rebellion, the push for revising the Articles might have been slower and less unanimous. With it, key figures like Washington, who had been hesitant about attending a convention, became convinced that only a new, more robust framework could save the Republic from anarchy. In this way, class conflict, in the form of impoverished farmers versus creditors, directly influenced the shape of American governance. From the rebels' perspective, Shays' Rebellion had been an extension of the Revolution's promise. They invoked the rhetoric of 1776, seeing themselves as heirs of liberty resisting unjust authority. But the very same gentlemen who encouraged resistance to King George showed scant sympathy for resistance to the Massachusetts courts. The elite response to Shays' Rebellion was to reassert authority. In Shays' Rebellion, the elite confidently stood its ground and quickly dispersed the insurgents, notes one historical analysis. If during the imperial crisis the establishment had courted popular radicals, now, post-independence, they turned decidedly against them. The Massachusetts legislature, after restoring order, did pass some relief measures like easing tax collections, but also enacted a riot act and suspended habeas corpus to round up remaining rebels. The lesson was clear: the boundaries of acceptable protest in the new nation stopped well short of threatening property or the rule of law as defined by the property class. The Federalist elite would build into the Constitution both the means to suppress such revolts, for example, federal control of militias, and the structures, like a strong executive and an upper Senate, to dampen sudden populist pressures. The Constitutional Convention that met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was itself an affair dominated by the well-educated and well-to-do. 55 delegates from 12 states Rhode Island boycotted, convened with the initial aim of modifying the Articles of Confederation, but soon decided to draft an entirely new charter of government. The delegates included merchants, planters, bankers, and lawyers, men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. Many were creditors themselves and deeply concerned with issues of fiscal and social stability. Historian Charles Beard famously argued, in an economic interpretation of the Constitution, 1913, that the Constitution was a counter-revolution, a conservative document designed to curb the excesses of democracy and protect the wealthy class's interests in property. While later historians have debated Beard's conclusions, there is no doubt the Constitution reflected a series of compromises that largely favored continuity of the existing social order rather than radical change. Key features of the Constitution demonstrate this conservative tilt. It created a much stronger federal government, yes, but one constrained by various checks and balances to prevent any one faction, especially a populist majority, from dominating. The only part of the new government elected directly by the people was the House of Representatives. The Senate, crucially, equal representation for states regardless of population, was to be chosen by state legislatures, serving as a kind of sober second thought, often aligned with elite interests. The president, though indirectly chosen by an electoral college, would have significant powers to enforce laws and suppress insurrections, and the judiciary, appointed for life, would stand as a bulwark against what Hamilton later called the tyranny of the majority. On the specific issue of rebellions, the Constitution unequivocally empowered the new government to put them down. Article 9 authorized Congress to call forth the militia to suppress insurrections, and Article 4 guaranteed the federal government's aid to any state threatened by domestic violence. This was a direct answer to Shays' Rebellion and a signal that future regulators would meet federal muskets. George Washington, now the first president under the Constitution, proved this point in 1794 by personally leading militia forces to disperse the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania, a tax protest by frontier farmers that he was determined would not become another Shays. The prompt suppression of the Whiskey rebels, who, unlike Shays' men, offered little armed resistance when confronted by 13,000 militiamen, showcased the new order. Dissent would be tolerated, armed rebellion would not. The Constitution also enshrined protections for private property and contracts, aligning with elite interests. It prohibited states from impairing the obligation of contracts, preventing state legislatures from doing what some had done under the Articles, passing laws for debtor relief that eroded creditors' rights. It established a system of federal courts where property disputes could be adjudicated without local bias. While the document said little about economic policy explicitly, it gave Congress broad power to regulate commerce and finance, to tax, borrow coin money, and promote the general welfare. This pleased those who wanted a more integrated modern economy, like merchants and investors, and curbed the kind of parochial populism that, for example, had led some states to print cheap paper money to satisfy debtors. In short, the Constitution was suffused with the values of the propertied class: order, creditworthiness, contract enforcement, centralized authority, all aimed at making the United States a stable and prosperous nation for those with capital. That is not to say the Constitution was anti-democratic in all senses. It was still far more liberal than most governments worldwide at the time. It rested on popular ratification by special state conventions and provided for significant representation. But the debates between Federalist supporters of the new Constitution and anti-Federalists who opposed it reveal that many Americans sensed the document's class bias. Anti-Federalist writers warned that the Constitution created a remote national government that would be dominated by the well-born and neglect the common man. They pointed to the lack of a Bill of Rights as evidence that leaders might trample individual liberties. In several states, ratification was only won after Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights to curb federal power and protect personal freedoms. Indeed, the first 10 amendments, adopted in 1791, assuaged fears by guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, trial by jury, etc., and by reserving unspecified powers to the states and people. This was a key concession by the elite to popular sentiment, a reminder that the people retained sovereignty and certain inalienable rights. Yet notably, the Bill of Rights also served to shore up the legitimacy of the new government without fundamentally altering its structure. The core anti-populist features of the Constitution remained intact. If anything, the Bill of Rights protections for property, for example, no taking of property without due process or just compensation, reinforced that aspect of the Charter. The early conflicts over the Constitution, such as Shays-type unrest and the ideological battle between Federalists and anti-Federalists, ended in a settlement that secured the American elite's vision. They had, in effect, constructed a political system in which they could govern a continental republic, confident that mechanisms were in place to contain internal divisions. Alongside the political consolidation came an economic consolidation. After 1783, the United States was free to develop its economy outside the mercantilist strictures of the British Empire. The years immediately after the war were tough economically, but by the late 1780s and early 1790s, the stage was set for rapid growth, and the nation's leaders took deliberate steps to foster a capitalist economy that would secure both national power and elite prosperity. The architect of this economic transformation was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, 1789 to 1795. Hamilton, a brilliant and pragmatic mind, believed that the survival of the Republic depended on binding the economic interests of wealthy merchants and financiers to the government. To that end, he devised a sweeping financial program. First, he insisted the federal government assume all state debts from the Revolution and pay off the national debt at full face value. This was controversial. Critics noted it rewarded speculators who had bought up soldiers' pay certificates for pennies on the dollar, but Hamilton prevailed, thereby establishing the credit of the U.S. and enriching a class of bondholders deeply invested in the government's success. Second, he created the Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791, a public-private national bank that would hold government funds, issue a stable national currency, and regulate credit. This bank greatly pleased the commercial elite by providing a secure place for capital and a mechanism for economic expansion. Third, Hamilton promoted manufacturing and industrial development. In his report on manufactures 1791, he laid out a visionary plan to encourage nascent American industries via tariffs and subsidies. Although Congress did not fully implement this plan, the intent signaled a pivot from a purely agrarian economy to a mixed one embracing commerce and industry. Under Hamilton's guidance, the 1790s saw what economic historians call a financial revolution in the United States. Government bonds began trading actively, banks proliferated. By 1800, dozens of new banks had sprung up in various states, and a stock exchange was born on Wall Street. Hamilton possessed a remarkably acute economic vision. His aggressive support for manufacturing, banks, and strong public credit all became central aspects of the modern capitalist economy that would develop in the United States in the century after his death. Indeed, Hamilton's program set the foundation for a national market economy. The assumption of debt and creation of a funded debt that is paying interest reliably injected liquidity and tied wealthy creditors' fortunes to the nation's. The bank created a rudimentary banking system. The mint and currency stabilized the medium of exchange. Hamilton's financial revolution brought secure government debt, fluid securities markets, and a modern banking system to the United States. These are hallmarks of capitalism, the mobilization of capital through markets and institutions, and they took root in this era. Not everyone was happy with these developments. Figures like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who became leaders of the opposition Democratic-Republican Party, feared that Hamilton's system favored a moneyed aristocracy at the expense of the yeoman farmer. They saw the speculative mania, the rise in public securities trading, and the concentration of wealth around the Treasury as dangers to Republican virtue. To Jefferson, Hamilton's financial scheme threatened to recreate the kind of entrenched class hierarchy that Americans thought they had left behind in Europe. The political clash between Hamiltonian Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans in the 1790s was, in part, a continuation of the question, what kind of revolution would this be? One that skews toward commerce, industry, and elite-led progress, Hamilton's view, or one that remains agrarian, egalitarian for whites, and wary of financial power, Jefferson's view. In the short run, Hamilton's vision largely prevailed. By the time he left office in 1795, the U.S. had strong credit, economic growth had resumed, and the federal government had firmly established its supremacy, helped by events like the crushing of the Whiskey Rebellion. The Federalist Party, dominated by Northern mercantile interests and conservative expatriates, steered national policy under Presidents Washington and Adams. Even Jefferson, when he took the presidency in 1801 after a bitterly contested election, did not dismantle Hamilton's system. He kept the bank until its charter expired in 1811. The genie of capitalism was out of the bottle. American entrepreneurs were soon launching ventures in textiles. The first textile mill, Slater's Mill in Rhode Island, began operation in 1793. Transportation improvements, turnpikes, canals, and commerce. The early republic saw the acceleration of a market economy that would, by the 1820s, start to transform everyday life, what some historians dubbed the market revolution. For the purposes of this essay, what matters is how this economic evolution reflected the consolidation of elite power post-revolution. The national government, as reconstituted in 1787 to 89, proved quite responsive to the interests of the affluent class. Policies were designed that, intentionally or not, benefited merchants, landowners, and financiers. Debt repayment, stable currency, treaties that opened trade like Jay's Treaty with Britain in 1794, which favored merchant shipping, and even military campaigns that opened land for settlement, benefiting land speculators and planters. Ordinary farmers certainly gained in some ways, for example, easier credit from new banks, more security from Indian threats as the army expanded, but they also often felt the government's weight, taxes on whiskey, enforcement of debts. The class conflict did not vanish. It transformed. After the Constitution, political battles often took place within the electoral arena rather than via pitchfork uprisings. The Jeffersonian Republican movement itself can be seen as a channeling of popular agrarian discontent into a political party that for a time unseated the Federalist elite. By the 1810s, nearly all white men, even without property, gained the right to vote in most states, a significant leveling within the white population. This was a legacy of the revolutionary ethos that even elites could not completely suppress. The idea of equal political rights for all white males gained ground, leading to what we call Jacksonian democracy by the 1830s. Yet it's crucial to recognize that this widening of political inclusion happened within the framework that the elite framers designed. It did not threaten the sanctity of property or the capitalist direction of the economy. If anything, it arguably stabilized it by giving the majority a stake and voice, at least among white men. The truly marginalized, black people, Native Americans, women, remained largely outside the benefits of this expanding democracy, preserving the social hierarchy even as formal political power broadened among the white populace. The time the United States reached the 25th anniversary of independence, some radical possibilities of the revolution had been foreclosed while others had been realized in limited fashion. There was no general redistribution of wealth or land, aside from confiscating loyalist estates during the war, which were often bought by patriot elites. Private property was sacrosanct. The rich remained rich. In fact, new opportunities allowed many to grow richer. But there were changes that did ease class tensions among whites. Cheap land in the West provided an escape valve for discontented Eastern farmers. The absence of primogeniture and nobility, both swept away during and right after the Revolution, meant that legal barriers to upward mobility were few, education expanded, and a growing egalitarian ethos among white men meant that the old colonial deference to aristocracy waned. Alexis de Tocqueville, visiting the U.S. in 1831, was struck by the relative social equality among white Americans and fluid class boundaries compared to Europe. These too were fruits of the Revolution, or rather of the combination of revolutionary ideology and material abundance in a new country. They were controlled fruits, however. The American leadership succeeded in creating a polity that was stable and flexible enough to adapt to democratic pressures without succumbing to what they feared as license or tyranny from below. A telling epilogue is the fate of those pre-1776 grievances we began with, the frontier farmers of the 1760s who had rallied against colonial aristocrats found that independence didn't automatically solve their problems. Indeed, some of them or their sons became the very Shayites protesting anew in the 1780s. But over time, frontier states entered the Union with more populous constitutions, for example, Kentucky, Tennessee, and more sympathetic policies like staying laws for debt. The energy of regulator-style movements fed into the rise of Democratic Republican clubs and eventually the Democratic Party of the 19th century. Meanwhile, the elite families of the colonial era often continued to dominate. The Washingtons, Adamses, and Randolphs kept their stature, but they had to contend with a more rambunctious public sphere. In that sense, the revolution was not a fixed event, but an ongoing process. Elites consolidated power in the short term, but they also unleashed forces, mass politics, capitalist enterprise, reform movements that they would not always be able to control. The American Revolution can be seen as a grand bargain between the lofty ideals of human equality and the concrete realities of class power. It was at once a genuine fight for self-determination and a conservative revolution that guarded the prerogatives of the well-to-do. Colonial elites managed, with skill and not a little luck, to turn a decade of popular ferment into a unified bid for nationhood, and then to turn that fragile nationhood into a stable republic that largely benefited people like themselves. They did so by directing popular anger toward a common enemy, by speaking the language of rights and liberty that resonated across classes, and by knowing when to compromise, as in adding the Bill of Rights, and when to stand firm, as in suppressing uprisings. In the Revolutionary era's violent whirl of crowds and armies, they kept their eyes on the prize: independence won, property secure, and social order preserved. From Bacon's Rebellion to Shays' Rebellion, from the Stamp Act riots to the Constitutional Convention, a thread connects the American experience, the negotiation of power between the elite and the people. The revolution did not erase that tension, it merely rearranged it. King George was gone, but King Congress or President Washington stood in his place, now accountable, at least indirectly, to the citizenry, yet also insulated from its sudden passions. The popular torrent that frightened the founders was channeled into elections, petitions, and the westward migration, rather than allowed to overflow in anarchy. In achieving this, the American Revolution was politically revolutionary but socially cautious. It unleashed democratic forces sufficient to prevent the formation of a new aristocracy of birth, but it stopped well short of leveling. It affirmed that all men are created equal in theory, but in practice it left enduring inequalities of class, race, and gender, largely intact, some even more entrenched. For generations to come, Americans would both celebrate the Revolution's liberating creed and grapple with its unfinished business. Abolitionists, women suffragists, labor unions, and civil rights activists would all appeal to 1776 in pressing for a more complete application of its principles. Each time, the descendants of the revolutionary elite, the government, propertied interests, social authorities, would have to decide whether to accommodate or resist these appeals. Thus, the class conflict and consolidation that marked the nation's birth continued to echo through its growth. In the final calculation, the colonial elites of 1776 achieved what they wanted. A national consensus for independence that cut across class lines, achieved victory with the indispensable aid of the common people, and then translated that victory into a republican framework that preserved their dominance. They proved astute custodians of revolution, harnessing its energy without succumbing to its excess. The cost, of course, was borne by those outside their charmed circle. Native Americans lost their lands. African Americans remained in chains in the South. Women returned to domestic silence. The American Revolution, seen through the lens of class and power, was less a sudden overturning than a complex realignment. It shook off an external elite, the British aristocracy and officials, and empowered an internal one, the colonial gentry, all under the banner of universal ideals that would challenge that very elite in years to come. In the end, the revolution's legacy is Janus-faced. It opened the door to radical possibilities, liberty for all, even as it bolted that door to keep most of those possibilities at bay. That delicate balance allowed a new nation to be born and to thrive, its people ever striving to reconcile the promise of equality with the realities of privilege. The story of the American Revolution is thus not only a story of America versus empire, but also of Americans among themselves, negotiating just how far the light of liberty would shine within their own society. The elite won the first round of that negotiation, but the debate, one might say, the revolution, has never really ended. Every generation since has, in one way or another, revisited the fundamental question first posed in those tumultuous years: how to secure a government that truly derives its power from the consent of the governed, and that serves the common welfare, without oppressing the few or the many. The revolution set the stage for that ongoing quest, leaving us a legacy at once inspiring and incomplete, a legacy forged in the crucible of class conflict and elite consolidation.